So, hello, we're here today because we want to take stock of where we are with the EU's financial data access regulation. Now, we last looked at this 9 months ago, and it is running pretty much in parallel with the UK's Data Use and Access Bill, as it's now called. And from the things we're hearing, things are really starting to heat up. The FIDA is about to enter trilogue, where the Council and Parliament get together to port over their respective positions and reach a final agreement, or will it? And since the Data Use and Access Bill has been picked up after the election, the UK government has just launched, to great fanfare, its AI Opportunities Plan. So 2025 is going to be a big year for AI, and the UK government is going all in. I think it's important to say that all of these initiatives are starting to coalesce and circle around one another. Different parts of the jigsaw puzzle start to land. So what does it all mean for the FIDA, and where are we going next? So I'm here with Marie and Nicola. We're going to take a closer look at what's going on. We're going to have a relatively loose three-way conversation this time, drawing out things that have been said behind the scenes in Germany and in the UK. So I'm going to leave it to Nicola and Marie to introduce themselves, but let's start with you, Nicola.
Hi, thanks for having me on your show today, Sam. I'm Nicola. I have been working in open banking for the last 7 years, and I've ran TPPs as well as service providers who use open banking technology. And I am very much connected into the open banking, open finance, open insurance community, and seeing what's unraveling and who are the drivers, and potentially also the one stepping a little bit on the brakes at the moment as this ecosystem unfolds.
Marie, do you want to jump in there?
Yep, absolutely. Again, thanks, Sam. Yes, I've been involved in open banking and now open finance and moving into smart data since the very beginning, sort of 2015-ish in the UK. I've run my own market intelligence and events business for many years, but now I work for the technologist Raidiam, who've played a very central role in the core infrastructure, the trust services for open banking in the UK, Brazil, UAE, and so forth. And I also track progress. So I teach regulators about open finance market progress for Cambridge University. And I generally keep an eye on what's going on, and I share what I think is most interesting on a daily basis on my Open Conversations newsfeed and website.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to turn first to Nicola, because I think when we had our prep call, there was some rumblings going on behind the scenes in terms of whether the FIDA would indeed enter trilogue. Now that's the expectation. I think it was felt that it could enter quite early and start moving along and be agreed before the summer. But there seems to be some doubt about that. And what do you think, Nicola? What are you hearing?
Well, the what's happening is obviously that we now have a new EU presidency. It's sort of switched from Hungary to Poland, and that switch has meant that the trilogue didn't start in January as we would have expected. And that's been used again by some industry lobby groups, predominantly insurance and predominantly from France, to start lobbying against the principle of FIDA. And whilst we think FIDA is way too far gone in the process and also in people's minds to be stopped, we now need to see how quickly Poland picks up the trilogue. And if they may have other priorities than the Hungarians to really push this along. But the general industry consensus, and that's also everything that I'm hearing from associations who are close to Brussels, is that we're still going to see FIDA going through trilogue and then becoming law either before the summer break or just after. So we're still hoping for July this year.
Okay, great. I think from a UK perspective, of course, we're not party to those discussions. But as I mentioned in the introduction, the Data Use and Access Bill, as it's now called, it's been renamed from the Smart Data Bill, is running in parallel. Now, there are a couple of things in it in terms of trust trust ID and verification and trust marks, which I thought obviously was interesting and perhaps a bit of a departure from where the EU FIDA is going. Marie, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, well, personally, it's a great step forward, or will be when we see it. It was, very much like Nicola was saying about FIDA and the EU presidency delaying things. We had the same thing in the UK with the government elections last year. It feels like it's ages ago, but it's only last year. And of course, that meant that the original bill, the Digital Information Bill, was paused. But they very, very quickly, and everybody was expecting this to happen, came up with something very, very similar, the Data Use and Access Bill. What's really interesting is the sheer number of government departments now looking at smart data and starting consultations for it. So we haven't got the bill yet, but the work is very much already underway. And in conversations recently with the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and the regulator Ofgem for the energy sector, they're already talking about the need for secondary legislation beyond the Data Use and Access Bill in order to create a smart data scheme for the energy sector. So they're starting to look at what the roadblocks, so not roadblocks, the key signposts are in terms of sort of moving us continually down the road. So it's really, really very encouraging. I was told very recently that the commitment seems to be for 5 data sharing, consent-driven data sharing schemes by 2030 in the UK. So we would expect property to be within that. There's a lot of work going on with the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. Energy, as I've just mentioned, there are several consultations going on in terms of consumer consent to move data, smart data energy schemes for meeting net zero, etc., etc. Some have been or are going to be slightly more problematic. There was a consultation recently with the telecoms sector for open communications. My understanding is that they had very limited participation from the actual telecoms companies themselves. So there's clearly an education piece, and that this is more than just a compliance exercise, and it's an opportunity. So I think the work that's going on in Europe with FIDA hopefully should pull the UK sectors along with it, and vice versa.
The EU has sort of decided to take a view of data pools. So for them, the financial data access bill is the first one, and then retail, energy, government, etc., are supposed to follow. And since we've now already learned so much from PSD2 for this, you could assume that there's learnings from what you've done now, but I would be very much in favor of also other sectors starting to form already, because otherwise there's just going to be a loss of time.
Yeah, so the UK has taken that umbrella view.
Yes.
With the legislation, and then we're going to need the secondary. So it's interesting to see which is going to deliver results most quickly. I'm not a betting person, so I'm not going to stick my hat in the ring on that. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts.
I would like to see how this first one, which encompasses 27 countries, works, in the sense that hopefully we will also have schemes and standards that will not be national. Because otherwise you've got no interoperability, which increasingly is important, especially when you're looking at the non-retail sector, so at the corporate customer sector. And I think that's going to be a really big proof of concept to operate and to make that happen.
Yeah, it's been, hasn't it, a question of which priorities do you focus on first? So I think there has been some conversation. Marie, you picked up on energy and property in particular. I think energy is very much at the forefront of the conversations that are being had beyond finance. And then property is kind of now coming in along the side. But those other areas seem to have fallen to the wayside, so like transport, telecommunications. And maybe that is because of the way in which those sectors are organised. I'm going to come on to that point, and you've started to pick up on it as well, Nicola, in terms of how do you start moving away from legislation into bringing some of these schemes into being, and what approaches are going to be adopted, because it does take quite a bit of organisation to move things along.
Yeah, I think it's exciting to see this happening. And what I really like about the FIDA regulation is that it's industry self-regulating. So the regulator has said you've complained so much about PSD2, now do it your way. And the big difference is that the scheme is mandatory. So everyone, once FIDA becomes law, just for those who don't know, 18 months after that, every single company that falls under the regulation has to be part of a scheme. But those schemes don't exist yet. So it's up to the industry to organize themselves and to create a scheme which will essentially be the governing body for all of what is FIDA, including monetization, because now people are allowed to charge up to a certain point, and again that needs to be defined by the schemes as to how much is going to be able to charge for API usage. But that sort of means that all of a sudden we have a weird banking system in Germany, but the three big banking associations have to start talking to each other a lot more than they used to. There's cross-industry collaboration now happening, because obviously what happens in the insurance world is important to banking. And do you create schemes that are overarching, or is it industries? The whole intermediary sector is concerned as well. So how do you really approach that? I'm sensing that there is, I'm not even sensing, I'm observing that there is a lot of coming together, talking, and also trying to find out what we already have, as to not reinvent the wheel. And there's a lot of orchestration needed.
Yeah, that's happening a lot in the UK. And you picked up on an important point with FIDA, which is monetization.
Yeah.
And another important point is liability. Now, with the monetization one, I was with a European Commissioner before Christmas, and he was saying that one of the learnings that they've fed into this whole process from open banking is that if you make it so that all the data that has to be shared is free, then you end up with fintechs basing their whole business strategy on free access to data. And then it becomes really, really difficult to allow people to start charging, so that you can actually create a self-sustaining, thriving commercial opportunity, because it would be so disruptive to the fintechs that have based everything on a free access model. So it's inevitable, and it's really encouraging that they are making provision for monetization right from the start in FIDA, because retrofitting it is just too painful. And obviously it will affect the finance sector that have this as a business model, but at least they won't continue the problem forward as other sectors and other schemes open up.
So what I think is really important, thank you for making that point. I completely agree, Marie. And what I think is really important is that this means that the quality of data that will come through the APIs is going to be much better, hopefully, than the ones what we've seen with PSD2, because there was no industry standard. There is the Berlin Group, which people mostly adhere to, but then exactly what kind of data to what quality they put through the APIs has never been controlled or audited. That's going to change with the schemes. And the fines, if you do not comply with FIDA, are hefty. But what now companies start understanding is that they need to, well, if they have to comply and spend a lot of money on complying, it's in their interest to also become a data user, which they haven't in the PSD2 open banking scheme mostly. And so the incentive for them is to put traffic on the pipe so that they can recoup that cost that they have to put into these schemes. So that realization is happening, so that this is not a fintech play purely. There's an incentive for existing financial institutions to create business models and create customer value, or process efficiency, etc., through data. And that's, to me, the encouraging side of FIDA and the way this is working, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense economically.
100%. And this is happening. Sorry, Sam, just one quick point on that. This is happening around the world. So
yeah.
in the last 6 months, the number of companies employing data in directors or having data in strategies, and I'm seeing this globally. So there's a move to being a data receiver as well as a data provider. And as you say, it's not just monetization. It's about making yourself developer friendly, so the best people and the best companies want to work with you. It's about efficiency gains, improving processes, minimizing fraud and risks. So it's definitely so much bigger than a compliance piece.
I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points. And one is around the costs, and the other was around the priorities. And I think when we sat down initially, we were talking as well about how government departments may or may not be viewing things. So in terms of the energy consultation, Marie, is that something are they starting to look about monetizing, commercialization and costs, or is that something that's beyond them? Because of course, some of the concerns are around competition type issues in terms of price fixing, whether indeed that arises or not. And I suppose the second thing was around the data piece, because I think you may have seen that the Tony Blair Institute had put out a white paper recently with Startup or Scale Up, I think it's called UK, and it was drawing on property and energy in particular. And I wonder if, and finance, sorry, and I wonder if that's because just as in the payments world, you have payments initiation and payment account data, which kind of runs along kind of customer data. And similarly, that's also something that can happen in the energy and property space. And that kind of speaks to your point, Nicola, in terms of how financial services more generally kind of can get involved in this space.
Yeah, so in energy, to start off with in the UK, it's still very early days in terms of exploring what the smart data schemes will look like. There's a couple of parallel tracks at the moment. There's a look into what the governance ought to be like. There's a look into simply giving consumers the ability to consent to share their data so that they've got better visibility and can switch providers more easily. And within that comes various protections as well. So for vulnerable customers, there is this already present, there's this scheme where they only tell one energy provider, for example, that they're vulnerable and they need, I don't know, bills in braille or whatever it is. And then that proliferates throughout all of the different providers. So it's a kind of tell us once scheme. So with the customer consent consultation, there's going to be a new national operator that's sort of set up to manage that energy data and provide people with a personal data right in terms of accessing it. They haven't, not as far as I've seen, they haven't got as far as sort of looking at the business models yet for the participants in smart energy. But it's very much focused around, as I say, the consumer and consumer choice. And in terms of property, I think one of the reasons why property has got such a focus in the UK is because there's been a huge amount of work done by the industry already. So the Open Property Data Association already has a standard. They've already got a scheme that is commercially in play already for some of their members. What they don't have is that API interaction with land registry and the tax office and local government to create a complete loop, a complete ecosystem for digitizing home buying. So it's a relatively small step for open property to come to fruition. And everybody identifies with the need for better, more efficient, cheaper, less risky home buying. So if the UK government could do one thing to increase customer adoption and participation in consent-driven data sharing, it's digitizing home buying.
Nicola, did you have any thoughts in property or anything that Marie has?
Yeah, I think so. We're not in that sector in the EU yet, but especially in Germany, I think having lived in the UK and understanding that everyone wants to get on the property letter, on the property ladder, it's a very different situation here, where the rental quota is much bigger, and people don't own as many homes as they do in the UK. But obviously it's a sector, especially also when you're looking at, people are now starting to look at instant mortgages, so instant mortgaging, where you basically have a full digital mortgage process, instant lending. But that's in the early days, and there's no move at the moment, or no active discussion I'm aware of in other sectors yet. So I'm still very much focused on open finance.
Yes, and the insurance piece. Just wanted to mention this bit around the FIDA and personal data in terms of sensitive data and the data use perimeter, if I may, now that I've got Nicola here. Because of course, I think in Germany you have these online platforms, don't you, that aggregate data and comparison services. And I think FIDA will bring those entities into the framework as well. Did you just want to touch on that issue?
If I understand your question correctly, let me know if I'm missing the point. Well, FIDA is going to be phased in different steps. So not all financial products will be exposed at the same time. And what's excluded is health data, and therefore also health, life insurance, that which is, I think, a pity. We're still thinking about the company pensions, that's still under review. But so nothing to do with health insurance and nothing to do with life insurance is going to come, because of those concerns of privacy and extremely sensitive data around health. But obviously we now have a digital health passport, so to speak. So you can now digitally share your patient history, etc., among doctors, and you can decide on who sees what. So that, for example, someone may not want to have their the surgeon see that they have maybe had treatment for psychological issues or stuff. So you can decide how that works. So that's already in existence over here, and it's a completely separate national project. So in terms of those comparison engines, they're having a field day. Some of them also have banks now. Obviously, that transparency that will come, especially even more transparency from insurance policies, but also investment products in terms of the pricing of them and the actual components, that's going to make the comparison world landscape. We have two very dominant players in this market, and that's going to make that even way more powerful. But it might also be a opportunity for other and new entrants to enter that game much more easily.
Yeah, no, it's really helpful. Thank you. Because, of course, from a kind of broader, I suppose, banking point of view, there's this whole question around credit as well and credit data. And of course, the data use perimeter is very deliberate in kicking that can down the road in terms of identifying where the parameters lie. And because of course that is a very febrile and controversial issue. And so I think it's for the European Banking Authority and for banking in terms of credit, and then IOPA in the insurance pensions world, which will kind of look at those perimeters in more detail as level 2. That's my understanding.
Yes, and obviously there's a whole topic around the credit bureaus, because obviously they've been siloing data and there's a lot of intransparency, which is changing because they've been forced to expose much more as to what data they hold about you. But it's oftentimes over here that people don't understand what's called the Schufa score is, and it's super important when you want to rent a flat, then people are asking for access to that score, and they will get information without you knowing what that information is, and that obviously the regulator doesn't like that at all. And with open finance, you should have way more control over what information you provide. It's going to give lenders a much better opportunity to enter into dialogue with you based on your own data, and also potentially create products that are giving access to different types of credit applicants that may not have been able to access that. And I predict that we'll have a very, very different way of looking at renter feasibility or renter attractiveness based on open finance than we've had with the credit bureaus in the past. So it's a very big, I wouldn't say attack, but it's definitely trying to avoid all siloing of data and providing maximum transparency about decision making to everyone in the market, but essentially the consumers and businesses alike.
Yeah, and I think the point about appropriateness in terms of what is visible. So we're talking a lot in the UK about data minimization and purpose, and also duration. So, making sure that you're only sharing the data that actually needs to be seen in order to provide the product or service, and that's held only for a short period of time that's required in order to provide that service, and then it's deleted or something secure is done with it, which I think is a really important move.
Same conversation, and that's to your point, Sam, as well, that there's so much legislation coming together. Same thing with the identity wallet and ADAS regulation, where people now go, well, what is actually needed in terms of your passport or your ID card, and what information, how often do you actually need to identify yourself with all of that information that's there, and what do actually the companies what are the companies actually needing, or the government needing, in terms of that data? So that's the same conversation from that side. And obviously the dashboarding that is required by FIDA, which is, not that it only makes sense to have that in a central location, my point of view, but theoretically every data holder needs to provide you as a customer, whether it be business or retail, with a dashboard where you can see which of your data is being shared with whom, and that you can decide to end that. And so it gives you that freedom to say, I know who I'm sharing my data with, which data points are used, and that I can also stop it at any given point in time. And that's completely, again, down to the schemes who need to then figure out how that makes sense from an industry perspective, because I don't see anyone accessing and logging into 20 different portals to check out what data they're sharing.
Yeah, well, I think this is where there is a slight departure perhaps between FIDA and the Data Use and Access Bill. We'll see how things play out, but it also highlights just how the ecosystem and different parts of the ecosystem plugging into one another is so important. So I think, yeah, I mean, you've mentioned the permissions dashboards in terms of notifications that you can switch on and off, on and off, on and off. From a UK perspective, I think we'll provide access through things like the driving license that's been kind of announced, because most people do have one, so that's quite a good way of pushing that initiative through the market. But there is this question about on off, I think, which still has to be bottomed out in some way.
Yeah, there's been a lot of work done. There's been a lot of work looked into in terms of consent, because that's really what we're talking about, is managing the consents and keeping track of consents in a multi-party ecosystem. So there has been, which have done a very good study for the UK on this, and there are some fintechs that are very well developed with consent management systems like smart contracts. So I think, again, the technology is there. It's just bringing it all together. And one of the things in common with FIDA and the schemes that the UK has already is this sort of centralized approach to establishing what the rules, roles, processes, permissions, standards are. And back to Nicola's earlier point, this is absolutely critical for interoperability. And that's one of the really interesting things about Europe, because it is the European Union, because citizens have the same rights in different member countries as they have in their own home country. It's going to be really interesting. There's a real opportunity to have this interoperability, because it's in law that they have these rights. If you look at interoperability for a data right globally, then it becomes much, much more problematic and not technically it's not a problem at all. But there is a limited commercial value to proving and creating interoperability. There are very few citizens who need to have that sort of full global interoperability for their finances and can't already do that with apps and credit cards and so forth. So that the actual commercial opportunity for somebody to provide services like that isn't there yet. But I think with the EU, we've got a brilliant sort of opportunity to sort of see how this can work in practice and to allow people to start innovating with that in mind.
Yeah, and you have most European countries, you have a rather similar, you've got GDPR, and then you've got pretty similar local adaptations of GDPR outside of the EU and Marie, a lot of the countries that have adopted open banking and are adopting open finance, data protection is not the same, which, to be honest, we sometimes think is a great thing, but on the other hand, there's a reason why we have GDPR. So I think that within sort of these similar countries, and the systems are going to be relatively similar, I assume. But we always talk about these open finance legislations, etc. Oftentimes, what we stumble about when we actually expose data and create business models around it, it's GDPR. We have to consider at least as strongly as the other regulation.
Mm-hmm. That kind of almost brings us back full circle, doesn't it, in terms of data spaces?
Yeah.
And thinking as well about the role I think financial services providers play in terms of their experience of processing and managing data, because it strikes me that although smart data is something else beyond open banking, open finance, it's still the kind of financial service providers or the financial world which kind of can play into lots of those other spaces. And so they still have an integral role to play, I think, in terms of disseminating knowledge, expertise, and information around how the whole ecosystem works. I mean, Marie, would you agree with that? I think you would.
Yeah, 100%. So I think there are three pillars or cornerstones or whatever you want to sort of describe them as, data sharing, digital identity, and payments. And the three are interlinked on any scheme for any purpose. So I think that sort of commonality will hopefully enable us to progress more quickly than if we were sort of inventing from scratch for each different scheme, each different sector. But yeah, and that's probably why starting with finance was such a good idea, because it's sensitive data, so you have the highest level of privacy required and security required. And as you say, it feeds into every part of the world. And another common thread within those is verification, and that comes to the digital identity piece. There's huge advantages to fraud prevention and protections, and being able to verify identity, income, employment status, residential status, etc., that you are who you actually think you are interacting with. These are big improvements that are going to benefit everybody. I think one of the key standards is the financial grade API, so FAPI, which has grown into dominance as a world standard for open finance. And that creates a level of security that we haven't seen so far. So a lot of the world's financial transactions and data are still relying on keys and secrets. So you have something that identifies you, an email address, and you have something that which is a password. But that provides identification from a person's perspective or a company's perspective, but it doesn't mutually identify who they think that they're interacting with. So having the data provider authenticate themselves with the data receiver and vice versa means that there really is less wriggle room for bad actors. And again, this is another key benefit of approaching data sharing with schemes like FIDA and smart data in the UK.
Yeah, and I think adding the whole component of anti-money laundering, which is also cross-sector relevant. So I think that all of that is going to get a much tighter grip on AML, which again is just hugely benefits the entire system and helps you detect or prevent bad actors to be in the market, and at the same time it's going to much make KYC and KYB much easier and much less costly for companies who have to do that. So I think there's always two sides to this. One is value creation in terms of new revenue streams and new customer groups, etc. And then the other thing is just digital efficiency and cost savings, which especially the financial sector, but I think every industry at the moment really badly needs.
And that also plays into better user experience as well, because you have better
onboarding. Less
onboarding.
friction.
Exactly. And the whole risk management, fraud management moves to trust, consumer trust, corporate trust in data sharing. So these things are all inextricably linked. And I think the fact that we got drivers like fraud really help move progress along, because it's something that no sector, no participant in any sector can argue against. Obviously it's an improvement and something that needs to be done. And the other advantages then have time to demonstrate themselves with innovation and, as you say, efficiencies.
Yes, there needs to be that as a baseline, doesn't there, in terms of ensuring that you have safety.
It's imperative, so you can have a scheme or you can have an idea which with the best will in the world is hugely interesting. But if there isn't a why now, if there isn't some imperative that's driving it forward, it just becomes a talking shop forever. So I think we have a lot of threads that are all coming together at the moment. And there's probably also a degree of competitiveness between the UK and Europe in terms of who's going to go further fastest. The UK was very pleased that it created the sort of gold standard for people to follow with open banking. They're aware that they don't hold that bragging right anymore. They are definitely pushing to try to reclaim those bragging rights with smart data. So that'll also be an interesting dynamic to watch.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you raised that point. And it's actually quite a nice way to wrap up the conversation, because one of the things that we also talked about was around how these industry governing bodies are going to, bring in, convene, have these conversations with different players within their sectors. But of course, from a UK perspective, we can do that on a national basis. In the EU, you can do it arguably you can do it on both an EU and a national basis. So I'm quite curious to know whether there's a preference across different member states, and I suppose that then plays into this whole notion about the architecture, because of course open banking was kind of predicated on the kind of payments network kind of infrastructure that was already in existence, but for other sectors that doesn't exist. We've kind of already talked about this a little bit, but do you have any thoughts then in terms of this kind of national progress versus EU progress against other member states' progress?
I think I'm always a bit jealous when I look at the UK, because I see, as Marie said, so much government action and sort of stuff that is really far-reaching. Now, I suppose for the EU, it's the EU actually that's that government, because I do not see a lot of action on a national government level. I wouldn't know who the principal actors would be from a from an active party or government point of view. Maybe I'm doing them injustice, but I just don't see or hear very much. Whereas the regulator is doing a strategic foresight process at the moment for open finance. So it's, for me, currently the strongest governance and the strongest people working on this is the EU, as well as then the national regulators. Whereas the national government, as I said, I don't see them anywhere, or see them on stage, or see them publish anything. So I'm not aware of that being a big topic. But at the same time, we need to just make sure we don't end up with a plethora of schemes. There's been a calculation and saying, look, at the worst, we can end up with 135 schemes in open finance in the EU. So industry schemes purely on a national level multiplied by 27. That's where you get that number from. And there's movement to say that we need an authority in the EU that holds the strings together to make sure that the different schemes do not, diverge too much in what they do, so that international actors like some banks and some insurances who operate in different countries, they obviously want to have international schemes, where some players who are smaller and just national say, well, we want to protect our national interests. We want it to be just this country, because otherwise the governance is going to be too big and it's going to be too expensive to be part of that scheme. So that's going to be very, very interesting. And then the different standards we already have, we see movements that some of them want to become schemes, others want to become cross-industry standards. I think we're most likely going to be ending up with the Berlin Group as being the open finance standard, most. And then there is insurance. Some countries who are much further with insurance data standards than others. Not really quite sure, but also the landscapes in the financial industry are different country by country. You've got some countries where you've got some very few but very big players, and then fragmented. The whole intermediary systems are different. Legislation around, especially the insurance and the financial advice, is different in different countries. So there's a lot of work still to be done. And I think that's why that dialogue and that understanding of what's already there, that sort of fact finding, is super important, so that you don't reinvent the wheel everywhere. And then this has been the saying at an event I was at, that there's kind of a bit of a feeling that no one really wants to do those schemes, and that they feel that the first person to move is going to have all the work and all the effort. And that's why everyone's sort of sitting and waiting and not really raising their hand. And then the joke was that, well, you're probably gonna then end up having an Amazon or someone else come in and saying, hey, we built you the scheme, with obviously their own interests in mind. So there's a lot of, I wouldn't say wondering, but there's a lot of thinking and discussion happening at the moment how to do this best.
Yeah.
But it is discussion and collaboration, which never happened in open banking in Europe, because it was a pure compliance need and no one wanted to do it. And so it's really refreshing to see the industries coming together and going beyond their own competition silos.
Sure. No, that's a really interesting insight, actually, that you think it's kind of gone beyond. So, on the one hand, compliance gave you an imperative, but now that conversation is beyond that imperative. Are people having those conversations? And clearly they are. So, yeah, despite the fact that there are costs involved potentially, because I think it's also about fostering a culture of innovation. I think people do recognize now, don't they, that we've moved beyond paper into a digital world, and increasingly it's going to become a digital world. So what do? Do you get on board, or do you just sit back and let it all happen? Marie, do you have anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say, well, firstly, you absolutely have to get on board, because you won't have a business model in 5, 10 years' time if you don't, because you'll be too far behind your competitors. And banks are beginning to realize, and by bank I mean any sort of incumbent data provider, data holding entity, that they're beginning to realize that they don't necessarily have to benchmark themselves against their traditional competitors.
Yeah, yeah.
There are new competitors, and ones they don't even know exist yet, that will come in and disrupt their business models. So going back to what Nicola was just saying about all the complexity in the picture that she painted about, oh my gosh, how much there is to do in Europe. This is an area where the UK really might, have the advantage, because the way that they implemented open banking, they got a lot of things right that Europe didn't. It was very prescriptive. It was technical. It was core infrastructure centrally for everybody. They made sure that paying for it was taken care of, slightly controversially with nine biggest paying for everything. That's not how it's going to go moving forward. But they basically went as far as they did because of standards, technology, and not giving people a choice. There's going to be a more hybrid approach to smart data, but that rigor of decision making that we've already had with open banking, I think that very much is going to be applied to smart data. And with less complexity, less actors, less countries with their own national identities to worry about, means that we ought to really be able to do it more quickly. So again, going back to the competitive nature of the things, just as as observers and contributors, both Nicola and I think will be fascinated, and of course yourself as well, Sam, to see how it plays out.
No, absolutely. I think this whole question of our no longer being part of the EU. So, I mean, FIDA in itself raises this. Those people who are providing service in the EU will still need to adhere to what's happening in terms of EU requirements. But in terms of some of the groundwork and thinking around the commercialisation piece, that can be done away from what's happening in the EU in terms of driving standards, if that makes sense. So that's where I think the UK is better positioned, actually, in terms of moving forward further and faster. And aside from that, I think it's hugely ironic that it was the UK that kind of led off on the whole open banking piece to begin with, and now we're no longer part of Europe. So there's a really interesting political dynamic / tension here in terms of providing services, not only for for customers here in the UK in terms of smart data, but also in terms of financial services, particularly in terms of where they go now for Europe. We'll just have to keep on talking, I think, and lots of useful opinions and thoughts from yourselves. I think we're going to wrap up now, so thank you very much. And I'm sure that as time goes on, and once some of this legislation does start to bite down, there's going to be lots of more interesting, exciting conversations to be had. So thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure, as always, to see you both, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you so much, both.